So today we're going to go into some memory research. How good is our memory for detail versus the gist, the more abstracted form of information? We'll show that memory is pretty good overall, but occasionally our memories are distorted due to a variety of factors. One is our general knowledge, our knowledge of the sort of statistical relationships between things in the world, also known as schematic knowledge. That can actually have an influence on how we encode information and how we retrieve information. And we'll show an example based on semantic associations, how our memory for verbal information can be influenced by semantic knowledge, associations between words. Our memories can also be distorted not just by the information that's in our own minds, but the information that we receive from other people. Suggestions from other people can be helpful, can also hurt our memories. There can be misinformation that can distort our memories. And we'll discuss some problems with photo lineups that have to do with memory issues. So let's start with an example. I'm going to show you a photo of a friend of mine. He actually doesn't know that I'm showing this photo. I hope he's okay with it. He's actually a colleague at Princeton, and we know each other from grad school. But suppose this is a person you've witnessed at a crime scene, right? Some terrible crime scene, and this person was there. Okay, look at him. Okay, that was it. I'll test your memory later. Okay, so now let's discuss how good your memory is for details of things. Sometimes we have a sense, sometimes a mistaken sense, that we can remember all the details of an image. Something as common as a penny, we think we have pretty good memory for the details. But how good is that memory? So one of these pennies is correct, the other one's incorrect. Is there somebody who's confident without having looked up the answer before about what the answer is? I? Okay. You reasonably confident? Okay. Any other answers? Oh, sorry. Yeah. A? Okay. And you're also reasonably confident? Yeah. One of you must be wrong, right? Or you're both wrong. Any other answers? B? Okay. V? D? Oh, E, sorry. All right, my hearing is not great. E, okay, so another answer. One more. G, okay. So there's not a lot of agreement about the answer. So maybe we can go through these questions to try to get to the answer. Does Lincoln face to the right or to the left? Facing to the right, okay. So that one is correct. Is there anything above his head? Yes. What is it? Something above his head, very good. Okay. Anything below his head? How about something to the left? Yes. What is it? All right, well, so what does the penny look like? It's answer G. So it's a tricky test. So some people believe that they have, memories of like a photographic memory. And studies have shown that there's no such thing as photographic memory. There are a few rare individuals that have what's called eidetic memory, they tend to be children between the age of 6 and 12 that can look at an image, not something as common as this, but let's say it's a picture or photograph, and then for a few minutes recall very vividly all the details of that photograph. Adults don't tend to have that capability. Most people, most of us, we form some abstraction of a penny or some other visual stimulus, and we think that we are holding on to all this visual detail. So memory is better for meaningful features than the details of things, details of language or perception. It's not important for you to distinguish between Lincoln facing right or left. Most of you know that, but it's not important to distinguish between those things because it's not something that makes a distinction between coins. And we tend to remember the gist, some abstraction of the information, better than the detail. So that raises the question, how do we remember detail if these are missing from memory? And researchers believe that our memory is mostly reconstructive. So we don't passively store information in memory and then retrieve that information from memory. There's an active process of reconstruction during encoding as well as retrieval. So that the memories you end up retrieving are based on the actual events, some schematic knowledge. I'll give some examples of what I mean by schematic knowledge later, but basically your general knowledge or prior knowledge, other experiences that are related to these actual events, and expectations, any stereotypes, any other expectations that you have. So there's a lot of other stuff that you build into your memories. Most of the time that's good. Most of the time that allows us to retrieve far more information than we could without this extra stuff. And sometimes it leads to mistakes. And we'll talk about some of these mistakes. We can make errors due to our schematic knowledge. We can make errors due to semantic associations that we have, the knowledge of our connections between words. And we'll talk about the misinformation effect. So I'll show you a classic study on the influence of schematic knowledge. This experiment was done in the late 1970s. It was published in 1981. It's a little dated. It might not work anymore. In the actual experiments, subjects come into the office of a graduate student. And they're told to sit down on a chair and wait until they can go into some other room where the actual experiment is supposed to happen. But as it happens, their waiting in the graduate office is part of the experiment. They're later asked to remember details from that room. Now this is the room that they were waiting in. So it's kind of an old office. Graduate students' offices might not look like this anymore. But suppose you are sitting there waiting and you have no idea that you will be part of a memory experiment. And now you're being asked, what do you remember from that room? Chair. Skull. Fan. Table. So these are some things that people remember. It's a little different when you're there, right? When you're actually in that room, where there's a lot more detail available than when you're looking at this photograph. And the result is that 30% of subjects, they falsely recall that books were present. And this office was carefully manipulated, if you will. All books were removed. So if we go back to this image, now it's not quite the same being there versus looking at an image. You might think that this might be a stack of books, but I think it was a stack of magazines. And if you were there, you would know that. If you would look right there at them, you would realize it. So there were actually no books present, but 30% of subjects do recall books. So what's going on there? So people are using a schema. People using their knowledge of typical components of an experience. So you know that most offices contain a chair, a table, computer, the typical things that you can expect there. So you don't actually have to encode all this information. You expect it to be there, it's probably there. Why bother going through the effort of explicitly encoding that? The skull is kind of unusual. Many of you noticed the skull. It's a good thing to specifically remember the unusual things, right? The ones that don't mesh very well with your schematic knowledge. Now all these are good things, except that if it happens that one typical thing is missing, like books, then you might falsely recall that information later on. Does that make sense? Okay, so here's another example in which information can get distorted by things we know about the world. So subjects in this classic experiment from the 1930s, they were shown these visual stimuli, and one group of subjects was given a set of labels as follows. So this stimulus was called a 7. This stimulus was called an hourglass and a ship's wheel and curtains in a window. And I don't know, after some retention interval, don't remember the details here, they were asked to reproduce those stimuli by just drawing them. And the people that saw this stimulus and it was described as a 7, they made it more look like a 7. The hourglass became more like a stereotypical hourglass. Now other subjects, they were given different verbal labels. So the 7 was not described as a 7, it was described as a 4. And they reconstructed the 4 more like a typical 4, right? And the hourglass, or this stimulus, was described as a table and became more like a typical table. So this shows that the exact same stimulus, the exact same photo or picture can be remembered differently depending on your interpretation. That's the key finding of this study. So you bring your interpretations to the table when you reconstruct. Okay, the other famous example of reconstructive memory is based on seminal research from Dees, Roediger, McDermott. And they developed a paradigm that's now known as DRM, the DRM paradigm. Now the book describes one example. We'll go through the example on the next slide. But I'll show you one example that's less familiar, the one I'd actually used in some previous research. So I'm going to play a list of words, and you'll have to remember this for a later test. Let's see if this works.
Crib, infant, cradle,
diaper,
bassinet, crawl, nursery,
rattle,
child,
carriage,
goo,
formula, birth, powder, doll.
Got that? All right. So now, did you hear picture? No? Did you hear crawl?
Yes.
Did you hear baby?
No.
Really? All right. Baby was a word that's related to all the words that you've heard, but it was not on the list. Some people that don't know the purpose of the experiment, that are not as well informed as you guys, will mistakenly believe that that word was on the list. Here's another example. And of course, this is a really bad way to do research, right, where you already know what's going on.
Blaze, flame,
inferno, torch, aim, smoke, dragon,
log,
burn, match,
hell,
wood, ash,
Fireman.
ash,
Okay. So did you hear smog? No. How about tree? No. How about fire? No. Did somebody hear fire? A few people heard fire. Was it fire or something else? Fireman, okay. You heard something related. It wasn't quite fire. All right. So the example that's given in the book is based on the list. It's called this, well, I shouldn't give the name yet. For those of you who haven't read the book, there's an advantage of not reading the book, I guess. Here's the list of words. So bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, nap, peace, yawn, drowsy. That's it. And in a typical DRM paradigm, you first have subjects recall the words from the list in any order they want to. And sometimes a recognition memory test is given, where you give people examples, just as we've done on the previous slide. And instead of saying yes, no, you're asking subjects to produce a confidence rating. Could be on a 4-point scale, so 1 meaning clearly not, 4 meaning sure, yes, I've heard or I've seen this word. So snore, what's your confidence rating for that one? 4. So sure, it was on the list. Rest? Sure, it was on the list. Coffee? 1. And because you're too smart? What do you think most people would say for sleep?
4.
They would say 4. Yeah. So the result is, if you're unaware of what's going on in the experiment, this word sleep, that was actually not presented on the list, but it's similar to all the studied words, is falsely recalled by a majority of subjects. Depending on how you set it up, about 60% of subjects believe that that word was there, so they recall it. It's easier to trick people if you present the words auditorily as opposed to visually. People's visual memory is a little bit better. And so what's going on here? Well, the way these lists are constructed is you look at words, and you take a word like sleep, and then you look at all the words that are related to sleep in terms of associations. So bed, rest, right? All these associations in this rich network. And then you take all these associates and create a study list from those words, but you remove the actual word sleep that was used to construct the list. And that's sort of the clever idea behind this paradigm. Because now you know that the word sleep is related to all of them, but it's not actually on the list. Now the most interesting finding is related to the confidence ratings, the recognition memory findings. So for the studied items, a word like rest, where many of you confidently said 4, the majority of subjects in these conditions also say 4. 75% of people say 4. So the numbers here are percentages of subjects. Unrelated items, so coffee is sort of related in a way, but if you do this with truly unrelated items, most people confidently reject those words. In this case, 80% of subjects confidently say it was not there, give a 1. And here's the interesting finding. 58% of people confidently, very confidently, say that that word sleep was on the study list. Now that confidence level, or that percentage, is almost as much as the percentage of people that were confident for the words that were actually there. So 58% is not quite the same as 75%, but it's getting up there. And sometimes if you set up the experiment in tricky ways, you can get the false alarm rate, as it's called, this percentage, all the way up to 75 or whatever the number is for the studied items. So sometimes people can't quite distinguish very well between things that actually happened and things that didn't happen at all. Yet they give very confident responses for those things that did not happen. So what are the implications here? So clearly there's an influence of semantic associations on our recall, our memory of verbal material, and importantly, our confidence can be very high for incorrect responses. Now normally, confidence and accuracy, they're correlated. Normally you would trust somebody who's confident about some memory. If somebody says, I really believe that this happened, it probably did happen, as opposed to like a less confident response. But there are situations, these tricky experimental situations, where you can have an inverse relationship between accuracy and confidence. Sometimes when somebody's very confident, somebody can be very, very wrong. And it's difficult to tell in advance when you are in that situation. Now there are some reported cases, some lawsuits, where a witness came to the stand and the witness expressed an extremely high degree of confidence about a particular subject being at the crime scene. Now imagine that you're a juror. You don't know what happened. The only thing you can go on is somebody's confidence, right? And if a person says, that's him, I'm absolutely positive, I'll never forget that face as long as I live, and you're the juror, what are you supposed to do? That sounds like an extremely confident response. It probably is true. As it happens, this is from a famous case. You can see some of the details on this video. This was a false memory. This was a witness who was remembering sort of things a little incorrectly. And later, I believe it was based on DNA evidence. This person was, the person went to jail for the wrong reason and was later exonerated based on DNA evidence. So these are rare cases, right, where eyewitness testimony is wrong, but it can happen. All right. So far we've talked about cases where it's your own, the information in your own mind that's misleading you. But sometimes other people can mislead you, and you can misremember things. This is related to the misinformation effect. So Beth Loftus is a distinguished professor here at UC Irvine, and she's done some seminal studies on memory distortions. One classic study she did was to show people videos. I think it was a sequence of slides where an accident was displayed, a car accident, and later subjects were asked, okay, how fast were the car going when they were, and then there was some verb inserted into this question. It could be a very suggestive verb like hit, when they hit each other, suggesting some speed, or a verb like smashed, which suggests like a high-speed collision, and sometimes a verb was used like when they touched each other. And this was just an innocent question about speed. And it turns out that how you phrase these questions influences the answer. So if you use a verb like smashed, you get a higher estimate of the speed at collision time than a verb like contacted. So clearly, you're being influenced by information in the question itself. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's debatable. Normally, people don't give misleading information to you. So it's a good thing to rely on what other people are saying. In this case, well, there are some legal situations where misinformation can have bad effects. And we'll discuss some of those. Here's another classic experiment from Loftus that we'll go into more detail. It's also described in the book, But we'll have one very tricky experiment, follow-up experiment, that's not reported in the book. And I can tell you in advance, you'll be a little confused by the sequence of experiments here, so pay attention. So subjects are, they're shown a series of slides that leads up to an accident. I think it was a pedestrian being hit or maybe a car crashing into another car. The details don't matter here. But in one of these slides, you see this red car approaching an intersection, and there's a yield sign. Okay, and that's part of, this is a scene that will be later tested. So in this experiment, after the slideshow, subjects have to answer a series of questions. In the experimental condition, the misinformation condition, subjects are given misleading information. So they're asked the question, did another car pass this red car while it was at the stop sign? Not the yield sign, the stop sign, which is wrong. And in the control condition, people are asked about things that are not misleading. So did some car pass this red car while it was stopped at the intersection? Okay? Now here's the critical thing. There was a later test, a two alternative forced choice test, where subjects saw one of the original scenes, the scene with the yield sign, and the scene with the stop sign. In the control condition, without misinformation, people are pretty good, so 85% of subjects picked the correct sign. In the experimental condition, the misinformation condition, the majority picked the wrong answer. They believed that the scene with the stop sign was actually the original scene that they saw. Right? But they just heard about the stop sign in the suggestive question. It was not part of the visual scene itself. So far, does this experiment make sense? Okay. So here's the tricky bit. How do we explain this? So clearly people are confused, right? So you hear about the stop sign in the question, but you saw the yield sign visually, and it leads to some confusion in memory. But what is the nature of this confusion? So one possibility is that when you have conflicting information coming in, that overwrites the original memory source. So there's some representation in memory that relates to the yield sign. And now you hear about the stop sign, and maybe you just overwrite that representation. So the yield sign is gone. And that explains why people are not very good at this later test. The other possibility is that there's interference. You do have separate memories, so you don't overwrite these memories. So you build a representation of the yield sign, you build a representation of the stop sign, and those coexist in memory. But the stop sign memory is more recent, because you just heard in a series of questions, and that's what you will go on, because it's a more recent memory, and you're just confused about the source. And that also explains the results, right? Because you just go with the more recent one, and the older one is still there, but it's being interfered with. So these are two different theories that make the same prediction. And there were some clever experiments to try to disentangle these two theories. And these experiments were done by McCloskey and Zaragoza. And this is probably the most confusing slide of the whole presentation. And for those of you who missed some part of the logic here, I uploaded some additional slides on this experiment on the website. So part of the experiment was a replication of the original results. Subjects saw a yield sign. Some subjects received misinformation, like as the car passed the stop sign. And then they were tested. Same as in the original experiment. Was it the yield sign or the stop sign? And they found the same results. In the control condition, majority of subjects are correct. In the misinformation condition, the majority of subjects are incorrect. Now, In another modified version of this experiment, some subjects again received misinformation. So as the car passed the stop sign. And then they did a new test. They tested the correct answer against a new foil. So subjects were asked, with these visual images, was it a yield sign or was it a no U-turn sign? So the no U-turn was never shown. They didn't see it during the study phase, they didn't see it during the suggestive sort of questioning phase. And the results show that 75% are correct in the control condition, and 72% are correct in this new misleading condition. So 70% of people that heard about the stop sign, they can nevertheless still remember that the yield sign is the correct answer. Now this is important because this suggests that the original memory of the yield sign is still there. It's not gone, right? So this overwriting hypothesis is inconsistent with these results. If you would get this misinformation about the stop sign and it would happen to overwrite this original memory, you would be a chance in this condition, right? You would be 50-50. Not only are you better than chance, you also are almost as good as if you had no misleading information, right? So 70%, 72% is almost as good as 75%. So that means that you just have a series of memories and they could interfere with each other, but when you have a condition where this interference doesn't play a role because you're asked about something that was there versus something that's irrelevant, you actually retrieve the correct information. So I know that this can be confusing, this logic. So is there some question about these results? Yes?
Is there any way that the yield sign and the stop sign could be included with the no U-turn? And that way you can see whether they can actually recall whether the yield sign was there or not.
So you mean a choice between three items?
Between 3 items?
That's interesting. That's very interesting. So some subjects could be correct. Some subjects could go with a misinformation, and some subjects, well, presumably nobody picks the no U-turn. I think that's interesting. I'm not sure if this has been done. I know that there have been many follow-up experiments, but that would give additional information. It's very good. Yeah.
I feel like people might have picked the yield sign over the no U-turn sign because, like, I don't think you'd stop at a no U-turn sign, and like they might just associate the yield sign with kind of stopping. That was my thought process.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So this is one particular example, but in the actual experiment there were lots of visual scenes. There were lots of different types of questions. So presumably, I forgot the details there, they counterbalance for a lot of these things, right? This is just going through the logic for one particular stimulus example. Yeah, you would really want to counterbalance for those things. Yeah. So any more questions about this? No? Oh, there's a hand. Okay.
Just to clarify, the one where you said test the U sign or the U-turn, is that incorporated into the question instead of the stop sign? Because I'm not getting that.
So, yeah. So this blue section, that's at the final test where you're shown a slide with it's a manipulated image where the yield sign is replaced by a U-turn, or you see the original image with the yield sign, right? So it's the final test that you have to pick one of the two. And then there's this intermediate phase of the experiment where you can get potentially misleading information during these other questions, right? And either you're a control subject, you don't get misleading information, or you are an experimental subject and you get some misleading information. Remember, there are 3 phases: study phase, potential misinformation phase, and a test final test. Okay. So why is this important? Well, In some cases, this misinformation can lead to mistaken identifications. So imagine that a crime scene happens. You are a potential witness. That corresponds to the study phase of like a memory experiment. You might be taken to the police station. They might ask you a series of questions about the potential suspect. They might even see mugshots of people. That can lead to misinformation. Then if you are in a final test, a lineup, where you have to pick up the person from the lineup, you might mistakenly pick up the person, not because you remember it from the crime scene, but because you remember it from a mugshot. So the practical thing that comes out of this research is that you should not ask leading questions as an investigator. You should not let potential witnesses see the suspects until the very end when there's an actual lineup. Okay, there should be no contamination. All right, so I want to show you a very similar experiment. This is Beth Loftus. So some of you might take classes from her. She's an amazing researcher. And here she is at 60 minutes. I'll show you a 2-minute clip where she talks about a very similar experiment involving misinformation. It's very cleverly designed.
One thing we know about memory is it doesn't work like a videotape recorder. You don't just record the event and play it back later, but rather it's malleable and it's susceptible to distortion, contamination, and other influences.
She asked me to study these faces. Then, after a few minutes, she gave me a memory test.
Which of these two phases do you recognize from the original study phase?
Right.
Okay, you pick right.
Left.
You pick left.
Okay, I said left, but I wasn't 100% sure. And then, the tricky part. Oh. Well, I'll tell you why I'm stymied.
Because I just picked this one on the left 2 seconds ago.
But now I'm not sure, because those two look very much alike to me.
But I'm going to tell you the left.
But I was wrong. It was the one on the right. And that's the whole point of the study. Loftus explained how, like her study subjects, I had been duped.
You saw this face. Then I gave you a test where I presented you with an altered face, along with a novel one. So I pretty much induced you to pick a wrong face because I don't even have the real guy there. It's an altered version. And later on, when you now have a choice between the altered one and the real one, you stuck with your altered left choice.
She says the more recent memory contaminates the original.
It makes sense, that study, right? Again, there was a study phase. There were a sequence of questions. Like, is it that one, that one? And during that sequence of questions, you insert some misinformation. So this person was inserted into this sequence, the similar looking face, and you're forced into, or not forced, but you're sort of duped into picking this one as being a face on that original list. And then later, you get the forced choice between the actual person that you saw versus this misinformation. And you go with the misinformation because it's more recent. And so it's very tricky to know when people are picking up on something genuine versus something that they saw somewhere else in a different context. All right. So now let's do a lineup. Remember this bearded friend that I showed you early in class? We're going to see if we can identify him in this lineup. So I have some other bearded friends from graduate school. And some of these guys I actually don't know. Have to get pictures from somewhere. So is there somebody who is willing to venture a guess?
4.
4? 4 was the one, guilty? Yeah. Awesome. Say that again? It's none of them? That's interesting. 7? Very confident? Yeah. How many of you think that, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. The third one. Yes? Number 8? How many of you think that it was none of them actually? Yeah, and that's the correct answer. None of them. So, police investigators, they try to do a good job of instructing people carefully, but most people have a sense that they have to pick out somebody from a lineup, right? There has to be somebody there that matches the original sort of description of what you remember. And this is the problem of lineups. There's this tendency to pick somebody out, and you just go with the most similar person from memory. And this leads to large false alarm rates. People mistakenly being picked out from a lineup. And so there are alternatives to this procedure, and they're currently being studied. This is part of an active investigation. One procedure that people have looked at was to sequentially present the faces. So you're shown person number 1, and you have to say yes or no. Yes or no. Yes or no. If you say yes, procedure stops. That's the person you pick. If you say no, it just continues. And you might say no to all of them, right? And that's the logic of this procedure of sequential presentation. There's a larger possibility that you say no to all of them because you don't know what's coming up, right? So there's less strategy involved. And the finding is that false alarm rates with this procedure go down. It's less likely that you pick up somebody that just happens to be similar. Unfortunately, the hit rate also goes down. So correctly picking up somebody with this procedure, that tendency is also going down. So overall, this procedure might not be actually better than the previous procedure of simultaneous lineup. So there's no actual, this issue has not been resolved yet. So it's an active research area, but it's interesting to manipulate the conditions in which people are tested. Simultaneous versus sequential. Maybe you can ask follow-up questions. There's a lot of ways in which you can do photo lineups. It doesn't have to be the classic simultaneous lineup. Does that make sense? Okay. The other big issue is controlling the lineup. Who do you pick to be part of the lineup? So clearly no individual should stand out. You should pick people that are similar to the original description. But this can be very difficult. And it's very difficult to avoid any biases in selecting the people for a lineup. So I'll show you an image, an actual lineup that was used in a case. I received this from a colleague, Jeff Loftus. And I can't tell you very much about this case. Except to say that it was controversial, because there was a lawsuit about the potential bias in this lineup. So here are the people that were selected for this lineup. Now I don't know these people, you don't know these people, but there's something not quite right about this lineup that was argued by the defense. So in this case, the witness picked out the suspect. And the suspect did go to jail, and the defense brought on a lawsuit about the potential problems with this lineup. And he did an interesting experiment. He asked subjects that did not know about this case, never seen these faces before, pick somebody from this lineup. Who looks just the most guilty? It's a strange experiment. Now, the logic is, if this lineup is balanced, then you should pick each of these people with, 1/6 probability. So about 16, 70% proportion for each image. Now, I'm just curious, how many of you would pick B? Yeah, I can't count, but I think that's more than 1/6. Is there anybody that would have a strong opinion about other faces? Just based on eyes? F? F just... His hair, okay. See, we could do real damage to society here, right? D? So if you do the experiment, 46% of subjects pick out B. This also happened to be the person that the eyewitness picked out. Now, this could in fact be the person who committed the crime, right? It's possible. But the defense argued this lineup is biased. It might be B, but if you inherently pick B for reasons because he looks smug or he smiles or, right? That's just not the right reason to pick out this person. So it's very tricky to have these balanced lineups. So to conclude, so we talked about remembering. Remembering is often reconstructing. It's an active process where you bring in all kinds of other knowledge that you have. It's not just reciting. Now, we've talked about some examples where memories are distorted, where people give the wrong answer, but it's very important to keep in mind, as the book also argues, our memory is most often quite good. All these, this extra knowledge that you use, general knowledge, schematic knowledge, even stereotypes, in most cases those are useful, right? We don't want to shut off that part of our brain, so to speak, that uses schematic knowledge or background knowledge, because we would be stumped. But there are cases where this leads to people being wrongly convicted. So, faulty eyewitness testimony is the single largest factor of false convictions. So of those people that are wrongly convicted, 75% of those were sent to jail because of faulty eyewitness testimony. That does not mean that we should get rid of eyewitness testimony, because there's a very large fraction of cases where eyewitnesses are just correct. Right? They're confident, they're correct, and they're sending the people to jail for the right reason. It just so happens that of the small subset of people that are wrongly convicted, it just so happens that it's often based on faulty eyewitness testimony. And that's it for today. I'll see you again on Thursday.